Plasticity of empathy and prosocial motivation from Outgroup hate to Ingroup favoritism.
So again, you know, it's a kind of a humble position as a fundamental social neuroscientist to speak to this topic. And, you know, we are obviously far away from having any real model of how to, I would say how to treat terrorism or to do intervention. But I try to kind of build up on Giacomo's talk and also, you know, a lot of talk we have heard, and just, show you how social neuroscience kind of tries to tackle the in-group, out-group question, and how you can actually also train the social brain, so train positive emotion like empathy and Mitgefühl like compassion and perspective taking, and how that could play out. I mean, I'm not saying that what we show you here, this is all healthy adults, and I show you some psychopathology patient data, but obviously we are not going into war zones yet. Yeah, there is a big translation needed before we can go in war zones. So just for, you know, as Giacomo rightly said, we always have to define the terms because we lost in translation when it comes to defining empathy. So I'm using empathy, compassion, emotion contagion more in line with what Giacomo presented, but, you know, and also a lot of social neuroscience or people like Dan Batson or Eisenberger, like developmental psychology, social psychologists, but there is not such a thing like a definition of empathy. It's a lot of different. So let me tell you how we work on it, and then, you know, I show you data. I think that's the important thing, not like the words we use. So I coded these kind of root here in red, and the data will be color-coded. So I hope that nobody is green red blind, because it's, you could imagine there is different routes to understanding other people. If I want to understand what their beliefs are, or feelings, or how their states or the motivational states are, we distinguish between a socio-affective root, which Giacomo was alluding in his last slides at the last time, yesterday, about, you know, sharing emotions with others. So emotion contagion and empathy is really about sharing an affective state with another. But emotion contagion can be completely unconscious. You know, my pupillary is contagious. I have no idea where the source was. Whereas in empathy, I'm also, you know, you suffer, I'm suffering. You are happy, I'm happy. There's a resonance, but I know that you are the source of my emotion. So I have a self-other distinction. This is why we have put it into this block, yeah? Now, empathy and compassion, I come to that later. We are starting dissecting the social brain, is also a reaction to the suffering of others. So it's an emotion, it's a motivational state, it's not a cognitive state. However, it doesn't need to be sharing the feeling. So it's not in resonance. It's what Batson called is not feeling with, but it's feeling for a person. So I have love and concern for, you know, my crying baby, but I'm not necessarily crying as well. I'm not sharing the feeling necessarily, yeah? It's what religion have called compassion, unconditional love, you know, this kind of concern. Now, the green pathway is what you could call a cold pathway or theory of mind. We have talked about it before. I'm using theory of mind in the classical way of defining it like Perna did and, you know, people in the 80s. It's really about inferring beliefs about the other. So if I want to understand that you have a belief that women shouldn't vote because women are inferior to men, that's a very abstract belief, no? It doesn't feel like anything. I can't share a feeling here. And I need theory of mind to infer these kind of beliefs. And the really difficult thing with theory of mind is if your belief is completely contrary to mine. You can imagine, I think I should vote as a woman, but if I want to understand why you act like a thing, I will have to do this cognitive perspective taking on very abstract propositional beliefs. Yeah. So why we bother about all that is because these roots, these kind of networks, both influence cooperation, prosocial behavior, aggression, and so on. So they influence, they motivate decision-making. Okay, so that we heard yesterday. Early empathy research in neuroscience was heavily influenced, by the work of action observation, like Giacomo was pointing out nicely, the mirror neuron system, and just ask, can we find something like that in the human brain in the emotional domain? So is there evidence that if we see someone suffering or pain, we activate nodes in our brain which also process suffering or pain in our own? Yeah, so this is now a paradigm which I used early on with pain. And pain is a very complex thing. So you have this kind of pain matrix in your brain lighting up. If, for example, I give electroshock to my hand, and we actually give electroshocks to the hand of people who are lying in this scanner. And then we measure in green the whole network in the brain which is activated when you really get pain. You have shocks. And then we measure in red the activation you see if a person sees someone next to the scanner suffering pain, but is not receiving any pain. So that's empathy for pain. It's like, how do I know how it feels for the person to get pain if I'm not receiving any stimulus? And what you see, and that's, and now the nice thing with this paradigm is it's only abstract cues. You don't see kind of painful facial expression. You just know my partner is suffering or so. What we can now do, we can put a lot of different people here next to the scanner. We can take in-group members. We can take people who are unfair. We can take men versus women. So we can vary basically the object of your empathy. And what we found is first, we started with couples because at that time we didn't even know whether we would find anything. At first, what we see now in meta-analysis is always these insula. We talk, Giacomo showed us insular data yesterday. They are also involved in suffering, emotional suffering, in pain, nociceptive pain, all kind of negative affect, disgust, taste. And the important thing is that these, what we call shared networks. So this network, this core network of anterior mid-cingulate and the dorsal anterior insula ranging into ventral banks of the anterior insula, it's both dorsal and ventral, are always activated when you see someone suffering and you empathize with it. And the more people subjectively report that they empathize and that they feel negative affect like pain, the higher this activation in this network. So to make it simple, of course, I'm not saying that this is an empathy area. I'm just calling it now the empathy for pain network, yeah, just for the purpose of facility later, yeah. So this was kind of the model after a lot of meta-analysis. The principle is whenever you want to understand what another person is feeling, you activate representation in your brain who are processing this feeling in your own brain. So like, we heard in the talk before, if it's pleasant touch, it's the medial orbitofrontal cortex. If it's, reward, it's nucleus accumbens. So but in the case of disgust, taste, negative affect, suffering, it's the anterior insula. Now, at that time when we discovered and saw that every brain basically had these empathic responses to the suffering of others, I thought, why is then the world as it is? I mean, the world is more like an absence of empathy rather than an omnipresence of empathy. And so I started asking myself, what are the contextual factors which dampen these empathic responses, which are quite, universal and automatic and fast? So what are the factors which could modulate that, which, what explains the lack of empathy? And so we started, of course, and one thing which we did very early is group membership, in-group, out-group. So we, used Teifel's minimum group paradigm, but also real groups in the scanner environment to see how that modulates. But we also were interested in another social emotion which only exists in German as a word, and this is Schadenfreude. So I think you probably know what this is. It's when you are rejoicing of the pain of another instead of feeling the pain with someone else. So you are basically feeling happy about someone suffering. So what we did is, first, one context which modulates empathic response is traits. So, alexithymic patients, for example, are patients who who can't recognize their own feeling. So they don't know what they are feeling, and these patients, or it's a trait, also have no empathic resonance. So it's almost like the representation which they are lacking to understand their own feeling cannot be used to understand feelings of others. Yeah? And we have shown that now because most psychopathologies like autism have a huge comorbidity with alexithymia, also depression. And so this is typically explaining why depressed people or autism can't engage in empathic resonances, because they have high alexithymia, which is a deficit of understanding what you feel, so you can't understand what other feels. Now, the thing which is much more important for this crowd here and for the question we have is how easy is it to actually reduce an empathic brain response just by inducing a certain belief. So imagine my brain is scanned, I get pain, and then there are people left and right of the scanner, they also get pain. And now I'm telling them, you know, the person left is from your in-group. So, for example, in Zurich, we asked football fans to come into the scanner. And then we said, you know, the person on the left is from your own football fan club. And the person on the right is from the enemy, it's Basel. Yeah, but you could do it in any country with any club. And the thing is, they didn't know this person. They just had this one instruction attributed, basically, this person to be in-group or out-group. And that was enough to measure in their brains a lot of empathy when the in-group, the so-called in-group member, suffered, and a complete lack of empathy when the out-group member was suffering pain. But what we saw, if the person in the scanner was scanned and the out-group member got kind of pain, was an increase in another motivational system, not in empathy networks, but in a reward system. So instead of feeling empathy and sharing the suffering with the out-group, what they now felt is reward. They kind of rejoiced seeing other people suffering. So that would be, for example, a question I would have, whether when you interview these kind of perpetrators, do they rejoice about the suffering of the out-group? When they kill someone, do they rejoice killing? Or is it really just about in-group empathy? Because the mechanism of in-group empathy is fostering, basically helping in cooperation within the in-group. But the mechanism of having Schadenfreude and reward signals going up is inhibiting empathy and is predicting a lack of behavior, like aggressive behavior. So we showed in later study that the more your nucleus accumbens, the more your reward was up, the more you were actually not engaging in altruistic helping, and you were even engaging in aggressive action. So meaning that you would inflict pain to the outgroup member instead of taking pain onto yourself to prevent another to suffer, which people do for the in-group. So in a way, you could say from the talk in this morning that these are the mechanisms explaining why you basically cooperate with in-groups, why you basically favor them up to a point where you would give your life, a real altruistic motivation to in-group favoritism. But in the moment where someone is attributed to be out-group, you are willing to engage in an aggressive act, and you have as a precursor a motivation which we call Schadenfreude, or the need for revenge. We asked these people in the lab, how much did you had actually a kind of pleasure of seeing them suffering, and also how much did you had a need for revenge? Because we also did these studies with playing unfair games before. We didn't do it only with in-group, out-group, but also with unfair behavior. And really interesting thing, I mean, this is not war. This is a lab situation with normal Londoners, and we did it in Zurich and in Leipzig. And still, this kind of manipulation was enough to induce really strong feelings of revenge and satisfaction of seeing someone from the outgroup or unfair suffering. So it seems to be a basic mechanism we all have. This is all healthy people who are not criminals yet. I mean, and still within seconds, just by providing different attribution of mental states or in-group, we could shift these motivational signals from Schadenfreude to revenge. Okay, so now, another thing before I come to the training and intervention data is the question about the difference between empathy, which is an emotional, motivational route to the other, and theory of mind. And so we developed for the training study a task we call EmpaTOM. And why we call it EmpaTOM is because it's a task which allows you for the first time to measure within the same brain, with the same task, the two different routes, the empathic route in the brain, which will allow to share feelings with others, and theory of mind, which is a cognitive group of allowing you to infer beliefs and intentions and thoughts of others. And so what we did, we showed videos of people telling you stories about their suffering in life, about when they were really, suffering about bad things, and sometimes neutral, and sometimes within the story, there were false beliefs inference you had to do. To understand why someone acted like that, you had to do cognitive perspective taking, you had to do theory of mind. So what we got is from one task, a kind of, you could say, cognitive perspective taking score, like a social intelligence score. How good are you in shifting perspective and understanding false belief of the other? And how much are you empathically resonating with the suffering of another? And so we did it in 300 people, so it's a huge sample. And we really could see that these, Insula, MACC, but also SMG, DLPFC network, you see here the Insula again, is really consistently engaged when you resonate with suffering of others. And that's a meta-analysis of the Silas group. I think, Giacomo, you mentioned it yesterday from BZOC. You see in black, there is meta-analysis of hundreds of empathy paradigm, which really, foster. Now, the important thing is within the same brains, it's not different labs now, it's really the same person, same paradigm. When they have to do cognitive inference about false belief, about belief inference of the other in green, you see the kind of so-called theory of mind, mentalizing, or default network. So again, there are a huge amount of meta-analysis out there now showing that this green network is engaged in whenever you have to do this cognitive perspective taking onto others. Now, we could for the first time ask whether there is something like a general G for social intelligence. So like in previous intelligence research, are the people who are good in reasoning also the people who are good in lexical intelligence and so on? We didn't know for social intelligence. So are the people who are naturally empathizing a lot with others also the people who are very good in theory of mind and have very high accuracy in perspective taking? And the answer is really zero, no. It's really a beautiful zero correlation, so it means some people just resonate a lot with the emotions, but not necessarily are good in getting these kind of, accurate belief understanding right. And some people are good in both, and some people, but it's not so. Because these two streams are so independent, even though very often co-activated in life, we could also train them differentially. And we also, so this is just for the neuroscientists among you, if you peak basically in SMG and TPJ, two nodes of the theory of mind and affective node, which are very important, like we heard about that for spatial perspective taking, but also for theory of mind, you see that they speak to two completely different resting state networks. So they are also dissociable on the level of resting state anatomy and functional resting state networks. And so what we ask now is, can we dissociate these abilities in psychopaths and in aggressive offender in psychopathology? And we have a lot of data. I just show you few because they might be relevant for this audience. So we just tested aggressive offender with the EmpaTOM, and we see that while they are very good in theory of mind, they are able to take the perspective cognitive of others. And I think you all know that one of the defining criteria for successful psychopaths is that they can manipulate other people in a very, very, in a very, very successful way. They know exactly what others need, but when it comes to empathy, to compassion, to a motivation to help, they basically completely lack an empathic stream. And we show that now with this very well constructed task within the same people. And the interesting thing is, whereas in aggressive men, psychopathology, psychopaths, and also narcissistic individuals, you seem to have this pattern. In autistic, you have exactly the opposite pattern. They have a deficit in theory of mind and therefore very challenging social cognition. However, they are actually okay in every social emotional processing if they don't have alexithymia. So that's the complicated bit. A lot of Asperger have a comorbidity in alexithymia, and this is then predicting empathy deficits. But if they are not, they actually can feel with another, but they have deficits in this kind of cognitive perspective taking. It's exactly the opposite than aggressive offenders. Or so after we had done this study, we thought, okay, plasticity. Can we change these social, emotional, and social cognitive ability in adult human being? And again, we are not doing intervention studies here in terrorist or extremism so far. It's really like the first study in social neuroscience ever, which dares to look at adult people and to see whether we can change cortical thickness and behavioral plasticity of these higher level dimension. And that's what I show you, but perhaps, these could be used because it's very universal to then adapt it to more to juveniles, to children, and so on. And a lot of people have asked us. So what we did is, perhaps I skip this because of time. This is basically another stream of work in dissecting the social brain where we had to differentiate between empathy and compassion. And perhaps I just show you the model and you believe me that the data are showing that this is right. So I show you the end model. So a lot of people think empathy and compassion is the same. It's basically a response to the suffering of others. But they are very, very different social emotion. So I talked about empathy. I said this is sharing the suffering. So if you suffer, I suffer. Now, empathy is a natural and beautiful response because it allows you to feel what the other is feeling. However, it can turn into empathic distress. And for a lot of people who work in war zones and come back with PTSD and with a lot of burnout, also in hospitals, nurses and doctors, what happens is that they have this natural empathic response. It turns into empathic distress and then becomes really maladaptive. So meaning that you share so much the suffering of the other that it becomes an illness. It can become, so stressful that you have a prolonged episode of stressful events which then kind of can cause illness. However, you can transform these empathic resonance, this healthy, in compassion. And compassion is rooted in a care system, affiliative care system which even the Wets have. It's not something high-level Dalai Lama. He perhaps works on global compassion, but I'm talking now just rudimentary concern for another is really a positive feeling of unconditional warmth and love. And so it's a bit like a mother who would kind of turn towards a crying child. And if the mother starts to cry all the time, the child will not be helped. And the mother will, elicit a spiral of empathic distress, and then the child will cry even more. So you have to transform the empathic response into this kind of compassionate, altruistic, warm concern towards the other if you want to be really helpful. Because then you engage in altruism, prosocial motivation, because the care system evolutionary have been built for altruism. This is also explaining why, for example, mothers would give their lives to save their children. It's a very old mechanism, and you can take advantage of this in cultivating compassion and training compassion by activating this system. So what we do in this training study, which is one of the largest of this kind, is a mental training study of a year where 300 people undergo in different cohorts 3 months mental training modules. And now you see why they have been color-coded. So what we train in these people is first mental stability and attention. Because our Western mind is so flattered and so non-attentive that it always bounces back to the future, you are never in the moment. So we use these kind of Eastern, Buddhist, whatever, mindfulness technique, but in a complete secular way to teach people how to actually bring their attention to an object of their mind. So it's really attention training, you could say, but to your body. And then in this 3 months affect module, we explicitly train empathy, compassion, how to turn empathy into compassion, and how to deal with difficult emotions. So it's basically, you could say, training the socio-affective route I showed you, yeah? And in the green module, we train metacognitive perspective taking. So we train what, you have talked this morning, theory of mind, and really like taking the metacognitive perspective on mind. It's a cognitive route, okay? And then we have a no training group, which just lives their life a year. And then we have also, lots of control groups. So just to summarize, we train in the yellow block because the data will be coded, attention and mindfulness practices. Then we, like prosocial motivation, care and compassion. And in the green is like cognitive perspective taking, okay? And this is the team of the teachers. And then we have an app. And so they can with the app, they make the mental training very, very controlled every day. And we know exactly who is training, who is doing what, and so on. And this is basically the model. We have 2 core exercises they have to do every day, 30 minutes, and then we can, measure their brain. And then we also had, this app which helped kind of facilitate a real controlled mental training every day. When they were in vacation, they were sending us pictures of how they were basically doing their mental exercises on beaches with the app on the ear. You see here, this app is lying here. And then what we also had to kind of train perspective taking and intersubjective skills, either like empathy, compassion in the affect module, or perspective taking and theory of mind in the green perspective module. People were sitting in front of each other, looking into the eyes, or at home they were connecting 10 minutes with another person via an app. And this is a new exercise which has, which doesn't come from Eastern practices. There you always practice alone. This is really a kind of, you could say, Western psychological implementation of contemplating questions with another person being present in your life, in your everyday life. And people really loved it. And at the beginning they said, are you crazy? I have to call someone 10 minutes a day and do an exercise and I even don't know this person. But then they got really addicted and hooked through it. And we stopped with one cohort 2 years ago, and they are still self-organizing to do diets, parts of the people. It's really like, and it's a bit like in the talk this morning with the fusion between group and self. We asked them also the self-other things. And before and after a diet, we asked them, how close do you feel to the other? And then after a diet, we felt, how close do you now feel to the other? And over the time of the 13 weeks practices, it comes closer and closer. So in a way, I thought, that's an interesting thing. I have always thought about these results that were published in JAMA Psychiatry as something buffering the effect of loneliness. We have a lot of problems with people feeling lonely, and loneliness predicts disease and also suicide but we also heard that loneliness is a predictor for getting to these groups. And while I was thinking these diets are super good because they kind of prevent loneliness, they reconnect you with others, they might also be the same mechanism than you observe in these extreme group, where they reconnect from their loneliness to other people and start feeling this merge of social closeness between self and other. This is exactly what we observe here, but we train that for the purpose of something good. And you seem to have that same mechanism going to actually drive these kind of extreme in-group identity formation. So this is just to show you that the people really liked it because they did 5 to 6 times a day over 9 months these practices, even though they were in their busy lives. And we had less than 8% dropout. So that's a Guinness Book of Record. For such an intervention study, we had less than 8% dropout, which really, and the people self-organized to continue doing these practices in their lives. Then we had 90 different measures. Obviously, I can't show you the results of 90 different measures. So I just show you some gist of it, which might be relevant, for the purpose of this meeting here. So what we hypothesized was that this kind of attention-based mindfulness training should increase attention on attention measure. Yeah, simple. Then perspective module should increase cognitive perspective. Okay, so what I showed you from this plasticity study is that it really matters what you train. So if you do mental exercises every day on attention, you will have an increase in attention. If you make exercises which allows you to generate positive affect and compassion, you will have an increase in compassion and also pure altruism, cooperation, and donation. I showed you that it's super important to differentiate between empathy and compassion and what is really the resilience strategy for nurses or caregivers or fighters or, military is very interested in learning that now to prevent PTSD from happening, because that's a big problem military has. And then perspective training really increases perspective taking, social intelligence, theory of mind, but not compassion. So the summary of the whole talk, I would say that I showed you that the social brain is a very complicated thing. You have to dissect all these constructs, and they rely on very different networks. So you have social emotion like empathy and compassion, which are different, but they both rely on motivational, emotional brain networks, whereas theory of mind relies on parietal prefrontal networks, which are really different, also developed different. I also showed you how fragile empathic brain responses is. It is enough to just make an attribution of a belief to another. You have never seen this person. It's in a lab context. It's not even in a political context. And you can, in the millisecond range, alter the brain responses, or like second range, alter the brain responses. Either you have empathy, you help this person, you have in-group favoritism, and you have warm feeling to the other, and in the next moment to another person you attribute outgroup membership or unfairness, you basically can induce Schadenfreude, which predicts aggressive behavior and painful. So this is, compassion is basically a resilient strategy, but I don't think you would start, training ISIS in compassion. I don't know. So I have not thought about how that could be used, but for sure, in healthy adults, training them in compassion trains them in being very resilient to and buffer them to the negative detrimental effect of, of burning out, of too much empathic distress. And what we also discuss is that for really moving to in-group, so what we want to achieve in this study is to move to global cooperation, global compassion, so beyond kinship favoritism. And now the interesting bit is that you need a combination of theory of mind and this kind of more ancient care and affective system to actually not only boost, so if you train compassion, you boost this pure altruism and in-group favoritism, but you not necessarily reduce the gap between in-group, out-group, because it doesn't help me to understand why you would act as a woman believing that women are inferior to men, different than I would act. So it doesn't help me to activate this kind of rudimentary care system if I don't also add the kind of wisdom and theoretical perspective on why people can hold different beliefs. And you need to have both together to move towards from this basic kinship compassion and kinship cooperation to more global forms of cooperation and understanding. And so this is what we just do with the macroeconomist Dennis Noor. And here this was, just a slide at the very end I wanted to add because we had this discussion yesterday. We are working towards a motivation-based decision model, not like a rationality assumption like the neoclassicistic economic models always assume, but we put psychological knowledge I just showed you in, and we, in psychology you have power, motivation, consumption, achievement, you have this threat system, and that was what I was referring yesterday. Instead of uncertainty, we talk about threat. And anger and fear are just two expressions of a threat system being activated. And now affiliation-focused system like care and affiliation, we know a lot from rats and neurobiology that actually, for example, with massage, you can induce, these kind of soothing, warm, caring feelings, but you also induce oxytocin to be released. And oxytocin, again, is to be found to be anxiolytic. So if you give oxytocin through nasal spray, you induce you basically prevent fear. You kind of reduce the fear response and also stress responses. So the question is whether through this mental affective compassion training you could achieve the same, but without any drug, but just by mental practice and by using these systems to work towards better cooperative society. And so we are doing these tasks, and we can actually really show that inducing power or inducing care or inducing sweat has, within the same person, a huge differential impact on decision making. So if you induce power, you get more punishment decision making. If you induce care and compassion, you have a reduction of in-group, out-group favoritism. You have more prosocial behavior. So you can really drive this biological system by knowing about these underlying motivational system and providing the context to drive one system instead of the other. And so I think that would be, if you have this framework, you might work towards intervention programs also against extremism, which uses this fundamental knowledge to, to basically shape behavior. So, okay, that's my group.